The modern nightmare and the Amish revelation picture this. You wake up early, coffee in hand, and walk out to your garden feeling hopeful. But the moment you reach your beds, your stomach drops. The kale has holes punched clean through every leaf. Your tomato plants are coated in a thick, moving carpet of aphids. And crouched at the base of your squash vines are clusters of gray bugs, quietly destroying everything you spent months growing. You go inside, grab the spray bottle, and drench the whole garden. Again, for the third time this month. And here's the maddening part. It doesn't work. Not really. You knock the population back for a few days, maybe a week. Then they return, sometimes in greater numbers, because certain insects actually develop resistance to chemical sprays over repeated exposure. You're spending money, breathing in toxic fumes, and watching your harvest shrink anyway. It feels like a losing battle you were never meant to win. Now let me take you somewhere completely different. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Drive through it in July and you'll pull over just to stare. Row after row of vegetables so lush, so perfectly formed, they look almost painted. Deep green potato plants, heavy tomato vines, squash leaves broad and unblemished, and not a spray bottle in sight. These are traditional Amish farms, and they have been growing food this way for generations, without a single synthetic pesticide. I spent some time in that region, and one afternoon I found myself standing at the edge of a potato field belonging to a man I'll call Eli, a quiet, unhurried grandfather who had been farming the same land for over 50 years. I looked across his field for signs of Colorado potato beetle damage. There were none, not a chewed leaf, not a single beetle visible anywhere. I asked him how. He smiled, bent down near the base of a plant, and showed me something I had never seen before. Running along the soil line, pressed gently into the earth at the base of each row, was a thin strip of reddish-brown metal, a copper ribbon, about 2 inches wide. He told me his father used it, and his father's father before him. He didn't have a scientific explanation for it. He just knew it worked. But what he said next stopped me cold. He mentioned a document, an agricultural report written in 1923 by a Penn State researcher, that described this exact technique in careful detail. A document that, according to Eli, quietly disappeared from circulation not long after World War II. And finding out why it disappeared changed the way I think about gardening entirely. The science behind the copper, the bioelectric effect. So, what is actually happening when a slug or snail crawls toward a copper barrier? Let's talk about the real science, because it's genuinely fascinating. Copper is a highly conductive metal. When a soft-bodied pest like a slug makes contact with copper, particularly in a damp environment like garden soil, a mild electrochemical reaction occurs at the point of contact. The moisture in the pest's body and the moisture in the soil act as a conductor, and the copper completes a tiny circuit. The result is a small but unpleasant electrical sensation that causes the creature to recoil and turn back. It doesn't harm them, it simply discourages them from crossing. This is why copper tape has been sold as a slug deterrent in garden centers for decades. It is a documented real effect. Now, here's where things get more interesting. Eli didn't just use copper, he also used zinc, specifically galvanized nails hammered into the wooden stakes at the corners of his beds. When I asked why, he said something like, "The copper alone is good, but together they wake the ground up." That's folk language, but it points to something real. When two different metals are placed in damp, mineral-rich soil, they behave like the terminals of a weak battery. Copper and zinc, together in a moist environment, produce a measurable low-voltage electrochemical potential. Gardeners who use both metals together consistently report broader pest deterrents than copper alone. Does this create some kind of invisible force field that repels flying insects from yards away? No. That claim goes further than the evidence it supports, and I won't make it here. What we can say, honestly, is this. Copper deters soft-bodied soil pests with a well-documented physical mechanism, and combining metals and soil creates genuine electrochemical activity that may influence the local soil environment. The practical results reported by traditional farmers and many modern organic growers are real, even if the full scientific picture is still being studied. What we do know for certain is that copper and zinc are both essential micronutrients for plant health. And that's a layer of this story that is arguably more important than the pest barrier itself. The history. Why nobody told you about this. Let's go back to that 1923 document. A Penn State agricultural researcher, working during a period when traditional farming knowledge was still being actively recorded, documented conversations with Amish and Mennonite farmers in Pennsylvania. Among the practices he observed was the use of copper strips and metal objects near crops as a pest management tool. Farmers he interviewed had been using variations of this method for decades, and some traced the practice back to German and Swiss settlers who brought it from the Palatinate region of Europe in the 1700s. It was not a secret or a fringe idea, it was simply how certain communities managed their gardens. By the mid-20th century, that knowledge had largely vanished from mainstream agricultural literature. Here's the honest historical reason why. In the years following World War II, the same chemical manufacturing infrastructure that had produced wartime materials was rapidly converted to civilian use. Synthetic pesticides, including DDT, became commercially available and were aggressively marketed as modern scientific solutions to age-old farming problems. Agricultural universities, extension programs, and farming publications increasingly focused on these new chemical tools because that is where research funding was concentrated. Traditional low-cost methods didn't require products to be purchased repeatedly. They had no industry backing them. This wasn't a dramatic conspiracy. It was quieter and more ordinary than that. The simple economic reality that chemical companies had money to fund research, publish findings, sponsor conferences, and advertise in the same magazines that farmers read. Folk methods that cost almost nothing gradually stopped being written about, not because they were proven wrong, but because nobody was paying to keep them in the conversation. The result, 50 years later, is a gardener in Ohio spending 15 years fighting squash bugs with increasingly expensive spray treatments, completely unaware that a 2-inch strip of copper from the hardware store might have solved his problem for under $5. And that's not dramatic villainy. That's just how institutional knowledge gets quietly lost when there's no financial incentive to preserve it. What copper and zinc actually do inside your plants. Here is the part of this story that I find most compelling, because it goes beyond the physical barrier and into the biology of the plant itself. Copper is not just a deterrent. It is an essential micronutrient that your plants actively need in small quantities. One of its most important roles is in the production of lignin, the structural compound that gives plant cell walls their toughness and rigidity. A plant with healthy lignin levels has thicker, harder cell walls. And harder cell walls are genuinely more difficult for small insects to chew through, pierce with feeding tubes, or lay eggs into. This is not a metaphor. It is basic plant biology. Copper deficiency in soil is well documented and leads to visibly weaker plants with softer tissue, exactly the kind of plant that pest insects prefer. Zinc plays an equally important supporting role. It is involved in the function of dozens of plant enzymes and is directly connected to the production of auxins, the hormones that regulate root development and overall plant growth. A plant with adequate zinc establishes stronger roots, grows more vigorously, and invests more energy into its own natural defenses. There's also a fascinating and well-supported principle in entomology that pest insects are not random in what they attack. They are drawn to stressed, weak, or nutritionally deficient plants. Healthy, vigorous plants produce a different chemical profile, different volatile organic compounds, than struggling ones. Many insects use these chemical signals to identify easy targets. A plant that is genuinely well-nourished, with strong cell walls and active enzyme systems, simply presents a less attractive target. You're not just blocking pests at the gate. You're building a plant that doesn't advertise itself as vulnerable. Over time, as copper and zinc gradually leach into the surrounding soil, the beds themselves become progressively more enriched. The system, if you want to call it that, does compound, not through any mystical force, but through straightforward soil chemistry. The 4-clay pot method, and how to set this up. Today. Now, let's get practical. The most interesting technique described in traditional records, and the one Eli called the heart of the garden, involves 4 clay pots buried at the corners of a planting bed. The logic is simple. Unglazed clay is porous. When buried in soil and exposed to rain and groundwater, it slowly absorbs and distributes moisture outward through its walls. If you place a small copper object and a galvanized nail inside each pot before burying it, the moisture passing through this clay carries trace minerals, copper and zinc ions, gradually outward into the surrounding soil. It's a slow-release mineral delivery system using nothing but materials that cost a few dollars total. Here's exactly how to set this up. First, if you have raised beds or defined garden borders, line them with copper flashing tape or thin copper sheet from a hardware store. This runs about $15 to $18. It creates the physical slug and snail barrier along the perimeter. Second, wherever you have wooden stakes or corner posts, hammer a few galvanized nails into the wood near the soil line. Galvanized nails cost almost nothing and introduce zinc into the immediate soil environment. Third, take 4 small unglazed terracotta pots, the kind that cost under $2 each, and into each one place a pre-1982 penny, which is solid copper, and 1 galvanized nail. Bury 1 pot at each corner of your bed, level with the soil surface, and leave the drainage hole unblocked so water can move freely. That's the entire setup. Total cost is roughly $20 to $25, and most of it is the copper flashing. What should you expect? In the first week or two, you'll likely notice slugs and snails retreating from the bed perimeter. By weeks 3 and 4, as copper and zinc begin to distribute through the soil, plants in that bed tend to show noticeably stronger, darker growth. By week 6, most gardeners using this method report a significant and visible reduction in the pest pressure they were experiencing before. This is not a miracle. It won't eliminate every pest in every situation, but it is a legitimate, low-cost, chemical-free approach grounded in real plant biology and a long tradition of practical farming knowledge. It works with your soil rather than against it, and unlike a spray bottle, it doesn't need to be refilled. The fact that most of us have never heard of it says less about whether it works and more about how agricultural knowledge gets passed down or doesn't. Start with one bed this season, watch what happens. And if you've been dealing with a specific pest that nothing seems to touch, drop it in the comments, because there are more of these old world remedies worth talking about.